we'll start with the posterior region of the neck here with our cervical vertebrae. You have 7 cervical vertebrae starting with your atlas up above, your C1. You have your C2, which is your axis, which contains the den, which makes up the body for the atlas. Your C1 or atlas articulates with your occipital condyles. And you have your 7 cervical vertebrae. Your 7th making up your vertebrae prominence. As you can see, your C1 and your C7 do not contain bifid spinous processes, but the others do contain bifid spinous processes. They also contain transverse foramen. After that, you have your thoracic vertebrae, which you have 12 thoracic vertebrae. Coming off your transverse process here, you have the ribs, which are connected to the transverse costal facets. Also, to the body of the thoracic vertebrae, you have your demicostal facets connecting to the rib as well. Making our way down the lumbar vertebrae, or our vertebrae, you have the lumbar vertebrae. They do not contain bifid spinous process, nor do they have costal facets or transverse foramen. They're much larger. They're spinous processes. More posteriorly of the back, you have your scapula. You have your spine of the scapula. You have your acromion process of the scapula. You have your infraspinous fascia of the scapula and your supraspinous fascia of the scapula. You have your superior angle of the scapula and inferior angle of the scapula. If you turn our skeleton around here, where the head of the femur meets is the glenoid cavity. You have your coracoid process. And underneath you have your subscapular fossa of the scapula. Up above here we have our clavicle. You have making contact with your acromion process, your acromial end of the clavicle, and your sternal end of the clavicle making contact with the sternum. Up front here we have our sternum. You have your up above your manubrium. Part of the manubrium is your jugular notch. You have your clavicular notch making contact with your clavicle. Here you have your sternal angle where your manubrium and body meet. This is again your body. And you have your xiphoid process all making up your sternum. Going down to the ribs, you have 12 ribs. You have 1 through 7 are going to be true ribs, and 11 through 12 are false. Included in the false ribs are your 11 or 12, which are also floating ribs. They are not connected to the sternum. 1 through 7 being true ribs, they are individually connected to the sternum by individual costal cartilage, while the 8, 9, 10, and 11, or 8, 9, and 10 are all fused together here on this costal cartilage, so they're not true ribs, they are false ribs. That covers this area. Going to the upper limb here, we have the humerus, starting up on top, which again articulates with the glenoid cavity. You have the head of the humerus. You have your anatomical neck. You have your greater tubercle and lesser tubercle. In between that, you have your intertubercular sulcus. You have your surgical neck, which is again more likely to be damaged. Distal to the humerus, you have your coronoid fascia, which again makes contact with your coronoid process. So you have your coronoid fascia. This is the medial side, your lateral side. So you have your medial epicondyle, lateral epicondyle. And again, only seen anteriorly is your capitulum. You have your trochlea. Again, your capitula making contact with your radius, and your trochlea connecting with your ulna. Posterior side of our humerus, you have your olecranon fascia, which again, your olecranon process of the ulna disappears into. Underneath here, you can see the trochlea posteriorly. And again, you have your media epicondyle and lateral epicondyle. Distal to that, again, you have your ulna and radius. if we look at it here anteriorly, you have your head of your radius, you have your radial tuberosity, what again your bicep connects to, and you have your radial styloid process. On this side we have our ulna. If we look at it over here, let's see a good view. Again, your olecranon process enters into your olecranon fossa. Your trochlea of your humerus connects here, articulates with your trochlear notch that's just underneath here. Again, if you look anteriorly at the model, your coronoid process enters into your coronoid fascia, coronoid process of the ulna. And again here, where your radial head meets is your radial notch. Again, on you have your styloid process of your ulna. So you have your ulnar styloid process and your radial styloid process. Moving down to the hand, you have your carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. So starting on this side, again, what articulates with your radius is your scaphoid and your lunate. I'm going to move this way and not clockwise, but the other way. So you have your scaphoid, you have your lunate, you have your triquetral, you have your pisiform here at the edge, you have your hamate, capitate, you have your trapezoid, the small bone here, and your trapezium. Starting with your pollex, you have your first metacarpal, second metacarpal, third, fourth, and fifth metacarpal. Moving down, you have your phalanges. You have a proximal, middle, and distal phalanx, 5, 4, 3, 2, and your first phalange or metacarpal only has a proximal and distal. That covers the upper limb. Going down, what articulates with your L5 is your superior articular process or facet of your sacrum. What we can see here again is your superior articular process of the sacrum. You have your sacral canal here. Sacral canal. Underneath that you have your sacral hiatus, this bottom canal down here. You have your coccyx down here. What we can also see on the sacrum is the posterior or dorsal sacral foramina. If you look at it anteriorly, you can see your anterior or ventral sacral foramina. And again, this is just 5 fused vertebrae, and you have 3 to 5 fused vertebrae in the coccyx. Your lumbar, again, was made up of 5 vertebrae, thoracic 12, and your cervical being 7. If you move down to your pelvic, you can see your pubic symphysis here. Can't really get a good view of your pubic angle arch down here. Looking inside, you have your pelvic brim. You have your 2 iliac fascias, your alas. Up here we have our iliac crest. Get a good view here of your iliac crest. Can't really make it out, but if you have your anterior gluteal line. In the front here, anteriorly, you have your anterior superior iliac spine and your anterior inferior iliac spine. Meaning, or articulating with the head of your femur here, you have your acetabulum, and just deep to that you have your acetabular fascia. Here posteriorly, we have our posterior superior posterior superior iliac spine and your posterior superior iliac spine. Posterior inferior iliac spine. Just inferior to that, you have your greater sciatic notch. You have your ischial spine. So we covered our 5 spines, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Just inferior to that, you have your lesser sciatic notch. You have your ischial tuberosity, and down here you have your ischial ramus. Again, what makes up your true pelvis is this bowl-like looking feature down here is your pubis and your ischium. What makes your false pelvis is your top ala of your ilium. looking laterally in here, you have your obturator foramen. Moving down to our lower limbs, you have your femur. You have your head of your femur. Looking posterior here, you have your greater trochanter, lesser trochanter, and your intertrochanteric crest. Again, only seen posteriorly is your linea aspera. You have your medial condyle, lateral condyle. In between your two condyles, you have your intercondylar fascia or notch. You have your lateral epicondyle and medial epicondyle. If we look down here, you have your patellar surface, which again makes contact with your patella. What we can't really see of the femur here is your fovea capitis. That's inside, that's right on the tip of your head of your femur. Again, you have your patella. You have your medial condyle of your tibia. You have your lateral condyle of your tibia. You have your tibial tuberosity. And you have your anterior margin or border, this front portion of your tibia. And you have your medial malleolus. Remember, your tibia is always going to be in the medial side. Lateral to your tibia, you have your fibula, which consists of the head, and your lateral malleolus. If we move down to the our foot, we can see here we have our talus. You have your calcaneus, which makes up your heel. Just distal to your talus, you have your navicular. You have your medial cuneiform, intermediate cuneiform, and your lateral cuneiform. More lateral to that, you have your cuboid, and distal to your tarsals, you have your metatarsals, which consist of your hallux, which is your big toe, which has only a proximal and distal phalanx, while the others contain a proximal, intermediate, or middle, and distal phalanx of your phalanges down here. I don't think we missed anything. I think we covered most